The wind carried the smell of wet pine long before the rain reached the valley. Vesper Hale stopped in the middle of the narrow trail and looked toward the dark hills. Flint, the old hound beside her, lifted his nose, then let out a low growl that stayed deep inside his chest. The woods had gone strangely quiet. Even the birds had disappeared. If storms could remember old promises, this one was coming back for something. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these frontier stories travel. Vesper shifted the heavy bundle of firewood higher on her shoulder and hurried toward the little farmhouse tucked beneath the cottonwoods. Smoke still curled from the stone chimney, but only a thin line. Her grandmother never let the fire burn that low, unless she had fallen asleep in her chair. She pushed open the door. The room smelled of cedar smoke, old blankets, and fresh bread cooling beside the window. Eleanor Hale sat close to the fireplace, her silver hair glowing in the evening light. A half-finished wool scarf rested across her knees, while her hands stayed perfectly still. She was listening. Not to the fire, not to the wind, to footsteps outside. 3 slow knocks landed against the front door. Vesper opened it. Sheriff Amos Reed stood on the porch with 2 town councilmen behind him. Their coats dripped rainwater onto the wooden steps. None of them smiled. The sheriff removed his hat. His eyes settled on Eleanor before returning to Vesper. The council reached a decision. Nobody answered. The meeting hall won't be opened this winter. Vesper frowned. What does that have to do with us? One of the councilmen cleared his throat. The town voted to keep supplies for tax-paying families only. The words hung between them. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair. Her hands rested lightly against the table for balance. I've lived in Red Hollow for 43 years. No anger, no pleading, only quiet surprise. The second councilman avoided looking at her. You're no longer listed as property owners. Vesper stared at him. My father built half the irrigation ditch outside this town. He did. And after he died? Silence. The records changed. Rain tapped harder against the roof. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. I argued for another solution. But I lost. Eleanor reached for her old coat hanging beside the door. The faded brown fabric had been patched so many times that almost none of the original cloth remained. She slipped it over her shoulders without another word. Vesper stepped between her grandmother and the doorway. We're not leaving. The sheriff lowered his eyes. You don't have a choice. Behind him, several wagons rolled past carrying sacks of flour toward the town warehouse. Children laughed while chasing each other through the muddy street. Nobody looked toward the Hale farmhouse. Not one face turned. The town had already decided they no longer belonged. The sheriff gently placed a burlap sack on the porch. Inside rested a loaf of stale bread, 2 potatoes, a small bag of salt, and 1 wool blanket. That's all I could bring. Vesper looked at the sack, but never reached for it. Eleanor quietly picked it up herself. We should go. The old woman wrapped one hand around her granddaughter's wrist. There was no shaking, no hesitation, only the steady grip of someone who understood when a door had truly closed. The farmhouse disappeared behind them as rain swept across the valley. Flint stayed close enough that his wet fur brushed against Vesper's boots every few steps. Neither woman looked back. By sunset, they reached the church. Warm light spilled through the stained glass windows. Voices drifted outside. Someone was singing. Vesper climbed the stone steps and knocked. The music stopped. After several moments, the heavy door opened only a few inches. Pastor Benjamin Clark stood inside. He recognized them immediately. Water dripped from Eleanor's sleeves onto the stone floor. Vesper spoke first. My grandmother needs a warm place for one night. The pastor looked toward the crowded benches behind him. Families filled every seat. Children slept beneath quilts. Large pots of stew simmered beside the fire. He slowly closed his eyes. The church is already full. We don't need food. You still need space. We can sleep on the floor. His fingers tightened around the edge of the door. I cannot make exceptions. Vesper heard coughing behind her. Eleanor covered her mouth with a handkerchief. When she lowered it, tiny dark spots marked the cloth. The pastor saw them. For one brief second, he almost stepped aside. Then, footsteps echoed from deeper inside the church. Several town elders appeared. One of them shook his head. The pastor's shoulders sank. I'm sorry. The door closed. The wooden beam dropped into place from the inside with a heavy thud. That sound followed Vesper down the church steps more than the rain ever could. Flint stopped in the mud and stared at the closed door. He let out a quiet whine. Even the dog seemed unable to understand why kindness had become so expensive. Night settled over Red Hollow. The forest ahead looked almost black beneath the gathering storm. Eleanor's breathing had grown slower. Each breath seemed to take longer than the one before. Vesper tightened the blanket around her grandmother's shoulders. We'll find somewhere. Eleanor managed a faint nod. You always do. The words stirred an old memory. She was 9 years old again. Her father stood beside Raven Falls during spring runoff. Water thundered over the cliff with enough force to shake the ground beneath their boots. He smiled while listening instead of looking. Stone speaks, Vesper. She had laughed. It doesn't talk. It does. He tapped the side of the cliff. When water sounds different, it means the mountain is hiding something. At the time, she never understood. Now, standing in the freezing rain with nowhere left to go, those words returned as clearly as if he had whispered them into her ear only moments ago. Stone speaks. Water sounds different. The mountain is hiding something. Vesper slowly turned toward the dark outline of Raven Falls. Somewhere beyond those trees, something her father had discovered years earlier was still waiting. She took Eleanor's hand. Come with me. Without another word, the three of them disappeared into the storm, while, far behind them, the lights of Red Hollow faded one by one beneath the rain. The climb grew harder with every step. Rainwater rushed down the rocky trail like dozens of tiny streams, soaking Vesper's boots until every step carried extra weight. Flint stayed ahead, stopping every few yards to look back, waiting until Eleanor caught up before moving again. The old woman leaned against a pine tree. Her breathing came in slow, uneven pulls. Small drops of water clung to her white hair. Vesper slipped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. We'll rest once we reach the falls. Eleanor looked toward the darkness. You remember where it is? I remember what Father told me. She hoped memory had been kinder than time. The roar of Raven Falls slowly rose above the storm. At first it sounded distant. Then it became strong enough to shake loose drops from the branches overhead. The forest floor turned into slick stone. Mist drifted between the trees like pale smoke. The waterfall finally appeared. Even after all these years, it stole Vesper's breath. A wide curtain of white water crashed over black granite, disappearing into a deep pool below. Spray filled the air until the entire cliff seemed alive. Flint barked once, not toward the water, toward the cliff itself. Vesper stood perfectly still. She listened. The waterfall thundered across the valley. But underneath that roar, something felt different. One section sounded hollow, not loud, not obvious, just enough to pull an old memory from deep inside her mind. Her father had smiled beside this very waterfall. Most people hear water. I hear empty space behind it. Vesper slowly walked along the edge of the cliff. Her fingertips brushed the cold rock. Solid, solid, solid. Then, nothing. The sound changed beneath her hand. She struck the stone gently with a loose branch. A dull knock. Then another step. This time the sound carried deeper. Her pulse quickened. There. Eleanor looked up. What is it? I think the mountain kept Father's secret. The ledge beside the waterfall looked impossible. Only a narrow strip of slippery rock separated the rushing water from the cliff wall. One mistake would send them into the flooded river below. Vesper tested the first step. Her boot slid. She caught herself against the stone. Flint crossed first. His claws searched carefully until he reached the other side. He turned immediately and watched them, almost urging them forward. Vesper wrapped one arm around Eleanor. Stay close. The freezing spray struck them like handfuls of ice. Within seconds, they were soaked again. Water crashed beside their faces so loudly that neither could hear the other speak. The ledge narrowed. One more step. Another. The current pushed against Vesper's shoulder with surprising force. She planted both feet, reached forward, pulled Eleanor beside her. The old woman stumbled. For one terrifying heartbeat, her foot slipped away from the rock. Vesper caught her coat before gravity finished its work. Neither of them spoke. There were no words strong enough for moments like that. Only breathing. Only moving. Only surviving. One final step carried them through the curtain of falling water. The roar suddenly became distant. The freezing wind disappeared. Vesper nearly fell forward. She lifted her head. A massive chamber stretched before them. Dry stone, high ceilings, wide enough to hide an entire farmhouse. Green light filtered through the waterfall behind them, painting the walls with moving reflections. Flint barked happily and raced deeper inside. His footsteps echoed again and again. Eleanor slowly turned in a full circle. Her weathered hand rested against the stone. It was real. Vesper smiled for the first time since leaving home. It never stopped being real. Near the back of the cave, she discovered something even more surprising. A narrow crack reached upward through the ceiling. A faint stream of fresh air drifted downward. She stood beneath it. The breeze touched her face. If air could move, smoke could leave. That changed everything. She hurried back toward the entrance. Pieces of dry wood rested beneath a rocky shelf, protected from years of rain. Some were old enough to snap cleanly in her hands. She gathered armful after armful. Eleanor prepared the tinder beside a flat stone. Her hands moved slowly. Even tired, they remembered work practiced over a lifetime. Vesper struck the flint. Nothing. She struck again. Only sparks. A third time. Still nothing. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her father had always waited instead of rushing. She loosened the dry moss, added thinner twigs, tried once more. A tiny orange glow appeared. Both women leaned closer. Vesper breathed gently. The glow spread. A small flame reached upward. Soon the fire crackled across the cave floor. Warmth slowly pushed back the cold trapped inside their clothes. Thin gray smoke drifted upward. It disappeared through the crack in the ceiling, exactly as Vesper had hoped. Eleanor stretched both hands toward the fire. Color slowly returned to her face. She looked at her granddaughter without speaking. Then she reached into her coat pocket. Inside rested an old brass key. Its edges had been polished smooth by years of carrying it. She placed it carefully into Vesper's hand. I promised your father I would only give you this, if we truly had nowhere left to go. Vesper turned the heavy key over in the firelight. There isn't even a lock. There is. Eleanor looked toward the deepest shadows inside the cave. You just haven't found it yet. A chill moved through Vesper that had nothing to do with the weather. She slowly lifted the lantern. Its light reached farther into the darkness, beyond the fire, beyond the sleeping place. She noticed straight lines carved into the cave wall. Not natural, not random. Someone had shaped that stone long before they arrived. At the center stood what looked like the outline of a doorway, but there was no handle. Only a small keyhole, waiting in complete silence. Before Vesper could take another step, Flint's ears snapped forward. He growled. Not toward the hidden doorway, toward the waterfall. Someone was outside. The growl rolled through the cave before the footsteps could be heard. Flint stood between the fire and the waterfall, every muscle tight, his eyes fixed on the sheet of rushing water. Vesper quickly covered the flames with 2 flat stones, leaving only a faint orange glow beneath the ash. The cave fell into darkness. Only the green light filtering through the waterfall remained. She held Eleanor's arm and guided her behind a wall of stone near the back of the chamber. Neither of them spoke. The sound of boots scraping across wet rock reached them a moment later. One man, heavy, careful. A shadow appeared behind the curtain of water. Then another. The first man stepped inside. Tall, broad shoulders. A long rifle rested across one arm. Rainwater poured from the brim of his hat. His sharp gray eyes moved slowly around the cave. Behind him came a younger man, carrying a lantern. The older man crouched beside the cold fire. His rough fingers touched the warm ashes. He smiled. They were here. Vesper's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. The younger man looked deeper into the cave. You think they're still inside? The older man stood. If I were hiding from the valley, this is exactly where I'd stay. His voice carried quiet confidence. Not anger, not excitement. The certainty of someone who believed every piece on the board already belonged to him. Vesper knew that voice. Draper Kane. The timber hunter people whispered about across 3 counties. The man who claimed forests the way other men claimed horses. He walked farther into the cave. The lantern light swept across the walls, across the fire, across the sleeping blankets. Only a few more steps. He would see them. Flint suddenly barked. Once. Loud enough for the whole cave to shake. Before either man could react, the old hound sprinted toward the opposite side of the chamber. His claws echoed wildly across the stone. Draper spun. There! Both men chased after the dog. Flint disappeared into a narrow passage, twisting away from the main cave. The lantern light vanished with them. Vesper grabbed Eleanor's hand. Now. They hurried toward the hidden doorway. The brass key still rested inside Vesper's coat pocket. Her fingers trembled as she pushed it into the tiny keyhole. For one frightening second. Nothing happened. Then, a deep grinding sound echoed through the stone. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The doorway slowly pulled inward. Cold air poured out. Not cave air. Fresh air. Old cedar. Dry earth. The smell of a place untouched for many years. Vesper pulled Eleanor inside. The heavy stone closed behind them almost by itself. Darkness swallowed everything. Only a narrow beam of light entered through tiny cracks above. Neither moved. Neither breathed louder than necessary. Outside. Draper's angry voice echoed faintly. Where did the dog go? Another voice answered. I lost him. Find him. Silence returned. Vesper rested one hand against the wall. smooth stone. Then, wood. She froze. Her fingers brushed the edge of something carefully built. She found a lantern hanging from an iron hook. Inside rested an old piece of flint. She struck it. The lantern came alive. Soft golden light filled the hidden chamber. Both women stood speechless. This was no natural cave. Someone had lived here. Strong wooden shelves lined the walls. Clay jars still stood neatly arranged. A stone fireplace occupied one corner. Above it hung blackened cooking hooks. An old handmade table remained exactly where someone had left it decades earlier. Dust covered everything. But nothing had collapsed. Nothing had rotted. It looked as though the family who built it had simply walked away one morning. Eleanor slowly crossed the room. Her fingertips traced the edge of the table. Then she stopped. A faded carving covered one corner. She wiped away the dust. 2 names appeared. Samuel Hale. Martha Hale. Vesper stared. Hale? Eleanor slowly nodded. Your great-grandfather. Vesper looked around the room again. My family built this? They disappeared before your father was born. No one ever told me. No one believed the stories. Eleanor walked toward a large wooden chest resting beneath the fireplace. The lid resisted at first, then opened with a long creak. Inside rested rolled maps, leather journals, bundles of old letters, and dozens of carefully folded drawings. Vesper picked up the first page. Her breath caught. Drainage systems, terraced gardens, hidden water channels, smoke vents, food storage rooms. Every page showed ways to survive harsh winters using the mountain itself. Some drawings looked almost identical to ideas she had been sketching during the past year. She turned another page, another, then another. Each one revealed knowledge passed through generations. Not treasure, something far more valuable. Experience. Years of trial and failure carefully preserved. Eleanor smiled quietly. Your father wasn't inventing those ideas. He was remembering them. Vesper gently closed the journal. Suddenly, everything made sense. Why her father listened to water. Why he understood hillsides. Why he always trusted the mountain more than the town. The cave had taught their family long before it taught her. Then Flint barked again. Not inside the cave. Outside. 3 sharp barks, followed by shouting. Another voice joined Draper's. Then another. Vesper hurried toward a narrow crack overlooking the waterfall. She carefully looked through it. Her stomach tightened. Draper Kane was no longer alone. Nearly a dozen armed men stood outside the waterfall. Some carried axes. Others held ropes. One wagon waited near the riverbank. Draper pointed directly at the cliff. I don't care how long it takes. He drove the blade of his axe into a nearby pine. They're hiding in this mountain. He looked toward the waterfall with a cold smile. And by tomorrow morning, they won't have anywhere left to hide. Night settled over Raven Falls without a single star showing through the clouds. The waterfall hid the sounds from the valley, but it could not hide the steady chopping of axes. Each strike echoed through the mountain. Each strike came a little closer. Vesper lowered herself from the narrow crack and looked at Eleanor. They're cutting trees. The old woman closed one of the journals. They're building something. A bridge? No. Eleanor looked toward the hidden doorway. They're trying to reach the ledge without going through the water. Vesper understood immediately. If Draper Kane reached the entrance, the cave would no longer be a secret. Everything they had found would belong to him. She spread the old maps across the wooden table. Most showed gardens, chimneys, and hidden storage rooms. One brittle page caught her attention. Unlike the others, it showed the entire mountain. Small charcoal marks traced tunnels beneath the cliffs. One passage continued far beyond the hidden chamber. Another symbol marked an opening overlooking the valley. Eleanor smiled faintly. Your great-grandfather never built only one way out. Before dawn, Vesper packed only what they could carry. The journals, the family compass, the old brass key, a few blankets, several clay jars filled with dried beans and smoked meat. Nothing else mattered more. Flint waited beside the narrow tunnel while Eleanor folded the final map. The little fire was left burning, not by accident, on purpose. Vesper looked around the hidden room one last time. We may never see this place again. Eleanor rested a hand on the rough wooden table. We'll see it again. Then she quietly added, if we leave something worth coming back to. They entered the tunnel. It sloped upward through solid stone. The air stayed cool and fresh. Sometimes they crawled. Sometimes they walked. Sometimes the ceiling dropped so low they moved on hands and knees. Hours passed. No daylight. Only lantern light dancing across damp walls. Then, fresh wind. Flint hurried ahead. A faint opening appeared between two huge boulders. Vesper pushed aside thick vines. Morning light flooded the tunnel. They stepped onto a narrow cliff high above the valley. The view stopped them. Red Hollow no longer looked proud. Fields lay empty. Fences leaned. Smoke barely rose from a handful of chimneys. Children wandered slowly between houses carrying empty buckets. Thin horses searched frozen ground for grass that no longer existed. Winter had arrived early, exactly as Vesper's father had once predicted. Far below. Draper Kane's men still worked near the waterfall. They had no idea another exit existed. Eleanor looked toward the valley. They're hungry. Vesper said nothing. She remembered the church door closing. She remembered the sheriff leaving bread on the porch. She remembered neighbors pulling curtains shut. The memories stood beside the valley like silent shadows. Then another memory stepped forward. A 16-year-old girl crossing a creek. Temperance handing over half a map, risking everything without asking for anything back. Vesper made her decision. We're going down. By sunset, they reached the ridge overlooking Red Hollow. The people gathered around small fires that barely warmed their hands. Children sat quietly. Nobody played anymore. The smell of empty cooking pots drifted through the cold air. Silas Marlowe noticed Vesper first. Relief crossed his weathered face. You came. She nodded. Help me unload. Together they carried sacks of food into the center of the camp. No speeches, no announcements, just food. One sack after another. The crowd slowly gathered. The sheriff stared in disbelief. So, you've been alive all this time. Vesper kept stacking supplies. I've been busy. Pastor Benjamin Clark slowly approached. His coat looked older than Vesper remembered. His boots were cracked. He stopped several feet away. I owe you words. Vesper finally looked at him. You do. I closed the door. You did. I've thought about that night every day. He lowered his head. I chose comfort instead of courage. Silence settled between them. The pastor waited. He offered no excuses, only the truth. Vesper reached into one sack and handed him a small bag of dried beans. His hands hesitated before accepting it. She spoke quietly. Feed the children first, nothing more. He nodded once. Tears filled his eyes before he turned away. A young voice called from the edge of the camp. Vesper! Temperance ran toward her. Her coat was torn. Mud covered her boots. She stopped only when she reached her. My mother lived. Vesper smiled. I'm glad. Temperance looked toward the food. You brought all this? We had enough. The girl lowered her voice. My father won't stop. I know. Temperance looked toward the dark forest. He's still searching for the cave. Vesper followed her gaze. Smoke rose from the distant mountain. Draper Kane had found the waterfall. He simply hadn't found what truly mattered. The next morning, Vesper returned to the hidden valley with Silas, Temperance, and several families willing to work. Not to take, to build. The old journals became more than memories. Terraces appeared along the cliffs. Rain channels carried fresh water into gardens. Clay ovens rose from stone. Food cellars disappeared beneath the earth. Every lesson preserved by Samuel Hale found new hands. Spring returned months later. The mountain bloomed with wildflowers. Children laughed while carrying water between garden beds. The hidden settlement had become a home, not because it was hidden, because everyone there had helped build it. One afternoon, Vesper climbed alone to the overlook above Raven Falls. She opened her father's old compass. The needle settled quietly, just as it always had. She smiled toward the valley below. Some doors had closed forever. Others had never needed to open. They had only been waiting for someone willing to keep walking until they found another path. If this story stayed with you, I'd truly appreciate it if you leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these frontier stories alive for everyone who enjoys them.